All right, in this video, we're going to look at how we can convert degrees into radians and then radians back to degrees. And before we do that, I want to kind of review a little bit of how do we convert. For example, if I was to give you 1.5 feet, so if we have 1.5 feet, and we want to convert this into inches, well, you're going to start with what's given, 1.5 feet, and I'm going to put that over 1 just as a visual. And what is the relationship of inches to feet? Well, we know that 12 inches is equal to 1 foot. So therefore, we're going to multiply by the 12 inches over 1 foot. Now, whatever you want to convert to, that unit will always go on top. So we want to convert to inches, so we're going to put inches on top. We want the feet to cancel out, so we're going to put the feet on the bottom. So therefore we would have 12 inches over 1 foot. And therefore if we look at this, the feet on top will cancel the feet on the bottom. And therefore your answer is going to be in terms of inches. So 1.5 times 12, you could simply go to the calculator and you would have 1.5 multiplied by 12. And we get an answer of 18. And the unit has to be inches. So therefore you know that you've done this correctly. So we want to do the same thing with our radians. So here, if we want to go from degrees to radians, okay, we need to know what is the relationship between the two. Well, we know that in terms of degrees, we know that pi is our radians, and what is equal to that? Well, if we go to the circle, if we go halfway around, we can think of this as either equaling 180 degrees, or we know that is equal to pi in terms of radians. So therefore, we know that 180 is equal to pi. So that's what we're going to use here to convert. So if I give you the first example, if we have 45 degrees, if we want to change 45 degrees into radians, then we would start with the 45 degrees. We can think of that as being over 1. And we need to multiply by this 180 in pi. Now the question is, what's going to go on top? Well, we want the degrees to cancel, so we need to have degrees on the bottom and radians on top. So therefore we would have 180 on the bottom and pi on top. So that's pi over 180 degrees. Okay, so therefore what's going to happen is the unit, your degrees, is going to cancel out. So once we multiply, you're going to have 45 times pi, so that's 45 pi over 1 times 180, which is 180. Now again, the degrees is gone because that's canceled out. So now all we have left at this point is to reduce this to lowest terms. Now typically we want to leave this in terms of pi, so we need to reduce 45 over 180. So all we're doing is reducing the fraction. So you could do that by hand, or if you want to use the aid of the calculator, type in 45 divided by 180. Now notice here I'm leaving out the pi because all I want to do is reduce the fraction. So I'm going to type 45 over 180 and go to math, number 1 is fraction, and that's going to reduce it. And of course we know that's going to reduce to 1/4. Now be careful, the answer is not 1/4, but it's going to be 1 pi over 4. And we probably talked about this before, that your 45 degrees is equal to pi over 4. And again, if you think of that in terms of the circle here, we know that this is 45 degrees, or simply this is equal to pi over 4. So anytime you're going from degrees to radians, you're going to be multiplying by pi over 180. So let me give you an example to try. Let's say that I give you 25 degrees. And again, you want to pause the video and see if you can work this out. All right, so we're going to take 25 degrees just like we did before, no matter what your angle is in degrees, and we need to multiply by pi over 180. And in doing so, this degree unit is going to cancel out. So once we multiply, we have 25 pi over 180. So therefore, if we reduce this, you could go to the calculator. We could type in 25 divided by 180. Math, change it to a fraction. That's going to reduce it to lowest terms, and we get 5 over 36. Now again, make sure that you write this as 5 pi over 36. Now, most of the time, like I said before, you're going to want the answer here as a multiple of pi, so that means it's some number multiplied by pi. If we go back up here, it is possible that we could actually come up with an approximation. We can come up with a decimal. For pi over 4, well, if we want pi over 4, we would simply just type in second pi divided by 4. Now make sure you use the pi key. We know that pi is approximately 3.14, but you don't want to approximate it. You want to type in the calculator using the pi key. And if we take pi divided by 4, we can hit enter, and we would get approximately 0.785. So approximately 0.785 would be the decimal. And we could do the same thing down here, 5 pi over 36. We would type 5 second pi divided by 36, and we can get a decimal for that as well, which would be 0.436. So most of the time we're going to leave it in terms of pi, but every now and then we want a decimal answer. So that's how we simply convert any degrees into radians. You're simply going to multiply by pi over 180. All right, next we want to go the other direction. What if we want to go from radians to degrees? And I know for a lot of you, this is what you like to do because you don't really like the radians and you want to change those radians into degrees. And once again, we're still going to use the idea that pi is equal to 180 degrees. So we'll start with the first example of something that we should be familiar with, and that is the angle pi over 3. And hopefully if we go here, remember if we're going from 0 to pi, we're going to divide this top part into 3 equal parts. So we would have 1/3, 2/3. So we know pi over 3 is here in the first quadrant. Now, if we start with pi over 3, we're going to have to multiply by this pi and this 180. Now in this case, we're changing the problem to degrees. So therefore we want degrees on top. So it's going to be 180 degrees and the radians of pi goes on the bottom. So now we can look at this and the pi on top is going to cancel the pi on the bottom. So once we multiply, we simply have 1 times 180. So 180 degrees over 3. And then of course we can divide 180 divided by 3 and the answer would be equal to 60 degrees. And if you go to your circle, we can realize here that pi over 3 is the same thing as 60 degrees. And once again, this is one of those special common angles that we're going to use. And this is the relationship that you should know already without having to go through this process. Though while you're in the process of learning it, there's no problem with actually multiplying and finding the angle as 60 degrees. Okay, so you're going to do that with any angle. You're just simply going to do the reverse of what we did up here. If you're going from degrees to radians, you're going to multiply by pi over 180. And if you're going from radians to degrees, you're going to multiply by 180 over pi. All right, let me give you an example and see if you can figure this one out. Here's your angle of 2, and we want to change this angle into radians. Now this one here, you got to be careful. This is not a multiple of pi. This is simply 2. It's not 2 pi. So we're going to start with 2. And once again, we have to multiply by 180 over pi because we're changing this into degrees. And now you're thinking, well, wait a second, there's nothing to cancel out the pi. Well, there's nothing here to cancel out, but we're still going to multiply here. So we would get 2 times 180, okay? and that's going to be divided by 1 times pi. Okay, so in that case, if you need to go to your calculator, of course, 2 times 180, we're going to end up with 360 degrees over 1 pi. Now, you don't want to leave the answer in this form because we're changing this into degrees. So we don't want to have pi left in the answer. So that's where we would go to the calculator. We would type in the 360 and divide that by pi. So here we come up with an angle of 114 point, and typically if I'm dealing with degrees, I'm going to round degrees to the nearest tenth, so I'd make this 114.6. So we get approximately, and I guess I should write this as approximately 114.6 degrees. So that's the answer that we're looking for. And again, notice this is 2 radians. It's not 2 pi. And if you recall when we talked about 2 radians, we talked about that as before. If you think of, remember on our circle here, if we take pi and divide that by 2, we had 1.5. So what that means is, remember, if this is pi over 2, this is about 1.5 radians. So we know that initially the 2 radians is over here somewhere in the second quadrant. And therefore, that tells us we know where 114 is. 114.6 degrees is at the same location as 2 radians. And just as a review, remember over here, this is approximately 3 radians because all the way or halfway around here, whoops, is equal to pi, which recall is approximately 3.14. So the number up here, when we have this 2, we're using the decimal form of our radians, such as when we had 1 radian, 2 radians, 3 radians, and so forth as we go around the circle. So the main thing you have to remember here is if you're going to go from degrees to radians, you're going to multiply by pi over 180. And if we're going from radians to degrees, you're going to multiply by 180 over pi.